Mr. Colby has agreed, as I mentioned earlier, to answer questions for the remaining amount of time that we have, which is about 20 minutes. Yes, sir.
Mr. Colby, sir, first, thank you for your comments. How would you propose to take your intelligence and your imagination and your experience and bring it to the table as an American citizen to carry through the points that you enunciated here tonight? And then how would you recommend that we could best put our efforts as citizens of America to join you in that work?
Well, I think that I do it by doing exactly what I'm doing right now. Speaking out to people, offering some ideas, which if they find them congenial, they will adopt them as theirs. 250,000 American citizens went into Central Park a few months ago to demonstrate, not in behalf of unilateral disarmament. They weren't a manipulation of the KGB. They were people who were concerned about this subject of nuclear weapons. And they came out to the churches and all the various groups of all sorts, not just the radical chic group or anything else. I think that this has had an impact. A majority of American citizens who were offered the choice to vote in the recent election on the nuclear freeze voted by something like 60-odd to 40 in support of it. I think the vote yesterday or day before yesterday in the House is a reflection. Our political leadership is responsive to our people. And my real hope is that it is precisely the leadership exemplified by Mr. Reagan who can make an idea and can carry it through the Congress and get it ratified, just as Mr. Nixon was the one who was able to open us toward a relationship with Red China, which his Democratic predecessors would not have been able to do. I think Mr. Nixon is concerned about the negotiations. He's got a simple approach to it, of course, which is fair enough, because that's one of the jobs of political leadership, is to try to simplify things for the people. But I think he is genuinely interested in trying to solve this problem, and that at some point you're going to see him turn and decide that his name will go down in history if he makes a real agreement with the Soviets to limit these kinds of weapons, and that's going to require an agreement that will satisfy the Soviets. Meanwhile, the rest of us can talk about it, can write about it, can talk to our congressmen and senators, and let them know how we feel. And that's the way this system works, and it works very well.
Yes, sir.
From your concluding sentence, I may detect some significant differences between the position which you have taken this evening and the position which has been enunciated in the Bishop's Paschal, which I gather you are in sympathy with. And the difference arises with respect to the strategy for reduction in armaments. On the side of the bishops, they are saying, freeze now, reduce nuclear armaments, even if we have to increase conventional weapons as the price for that process. Would you, without having me put words into your mouth as to your own position, comment on that position, and if you think they ought to be taking a different one, suggest what it ought to be?
Well, I think I would go along with that statement, that in other words, the nuclear weapon grew upon us rather gradually at the end of World War II. And by the end of World War II, it was not considered that novel a weapon. Because we had just, when we dropped it in Hiroshima, we had a very few weeks before killed more people in firebomb raids on Tokyo than we did in Hiroshima. The mass bombing of cities had unfortunately become an accepted part of war during World War II. It was rationalized as aiming at the industrial base of the country, the labor force that produces the sinews of war, but it still amounted to destruction of cities. And therefore, when President Truman was faced with a decision, I think he didn't conceive of it as a whole different step in the weaponry. I think, however, as it's grown in recent years, there has become a feeling that that is a really different step. It's potential is so enormous, and its effect is by definition so indiscriminate, that it has to be put into a different category. Now, if it is necessary to reserve our security by having adequate conventional forces to deter the Soviets from an invasion of Western Europe, General Rogers, the NATO commander, has indicated that if the NATO powers will increase their presently scheduled increase in conventional forces of 3% of their GNP per year to 4% of their GNP per year, that in a matter of 5 years we'll have enough to stop the Russians with conventional forces, and you won't have this additional nuclear dimension of war. War won't be very delicate and it won't be very much fun, but nonetheless, you won't have the nuclear dimension. Now, I think the bishops quite properly have indicated that, yes, that you do have a right of self-defense. You do have a right to protect yourself and develop the forces necessary for it. You do not have a right to an disproportionate force to do evil in the defense of good. You do not have that right. And that the nuclear question is so extreme that it steps over the edge there. Now, they're not calling for unilateral disarmament either. They're not calling for a no first use, as some of the former officials came out with last spring, that I disagree with, frankly, because that's a totally unenforceable agreement or a statement. The Soviets have said they won't use it first for years. Do you believe them? I don't. And I don't see why they would believe us if we came out with that statement. Therefore, that's a useless kind of thing. But the bishop's statement, I think, is an attempt to apply traditional doctrine of the just war to this new dimension of weaponry, which is such a totally new one that it calls for a new approach to thinking about it.
Yes.
I'd also like to thank you for your comments. I feel as one of the 40% who voted against the recession explained that I'm not.
It's all right.
Certainly, none of us, I don't think, are in favor of escalating nuclear arms.
That's right.
All that. We have maybe a difference of opinion on how best to go about reducing them. I happen to agree with the bargaining chip theory, and that since the Soviet Union doesn't operate in a democracy and the public opinion, that if we vote to reduce things or have a mutually identifiable thing, it only shows them that where our cards are. But my question is that obviously for time's sake, you've had to simplify when you talk about weapons being unusable and indiscriminate, because you know that there are new weapons being developed, the neutron bomb, for example, which are going to blur the distinction between indiscriminate and massive use and long-term radiation to a more conventional weapon. And I'd like to ask your opinion on that. I happen to think that may be somewhat a solution, actually.
Well, if you ask for a successful Soviet disinformation program, you have to give the neutron bomb credit as being one of their most successful ones. When the neutron bomb came out, or the idea of it came out, the Soviets put up the sophistry that there was something immoral about killing people if the weapon didn't also destroy property. That was a capitalist weapon. And they pounded that into Europe to a degree that was amazing in its effectiveness. The obvious answer to that theory was that of all the people in the world who should be interested in that kind of weapon, the Germans should be the first. Because it was the German cities that would be emptied of Germans if the Soviet forces moved westward. And it would be very much in the interest of the German people to have a neutron bomb used against a Soviet tank force and be able to go back and reoccupy their cities. Now, that's the theory of it. And as long as you have regular nuclear weapons around, then I think that thought process works. The problem is, as you say, there are always these edge points on any of these kinds of systems, any of these kinds of strategies. And if you do have to make a division between the nuclear dimension of warfare and the non-nuclear, then it is it's an understandable one. It's one that is enforceable in my mind. And therefore, you might have to give up some little edge point like that. And you wouldn't lose much because they'd lose it too. And you would have to give up that particular weapon on both sides in order to fit within the general category of the agreement, because otherwise you get lost in the trying to draw the line of distinction. I think that's the way I'd answer it. That as long as you're dealing in nuclear weapons, then it's nonsense to say that it's a capitalist weapon. But if you ever have the chance of eliminating the nuclear dimension, then I think it's worth giving up the neutron as well as the others in the process.
Yes, sir.
Sir, thank you for your presentation. In your opinion, if Baruch's proposal were reintroduced at the next SALT talk and coupled with a unilateral disclosure of our advances, considering that we are in advance of the USSR, how would it be received and what would be the outcome?
It would be too big a bite, unfortunately, for either country to absorb. I think that neither the Soviets nor the Americans could contemplate the absolute elimination of them tomorrow. You've got to bring them down and build the confidence as you go down, it seems to me. The idea of a one fell swoop elimination of it, with so much of the strategy, so much of the sense of security resting on them today, that is one of the problems with the President's START proposal. You see, it sounds very fair. Reduced from 7,500 to 5,000, half of them land-based. Until you realize that the Soviet nuclear force is about 70-odd% land-based. And they would end up reducing their land-based forces very substantially in order to meet the START proposal. Our land-based forces have very few warheads on our missiles, and therefore we'd hardly have to change our land-based force at all. Now, in the perception of the negotiation, what sounds like an even deal to a Soviet looks like, I tear up my weapons, you keep yours. And he isn't going to buy it. I think the idea of a total elimination of all of them is just too big a bite in one jump.
Could it act as a framework?
Well, I think various of our presidents have always said we'd like to get rid of them totally. The end product of the process should be the total elimination. President Carter, President Nixon, various others have said this. I mean, and meant it. They do want to, but it is a matter of gradual reduction as confidence is created on both sides that the security is unchanged with the gradual reduction of the weapons.
Yes, sir.
On that point of negotiating, our military says that their has superiority in land based. Fair to say that's not true, but we have superiority in sea. How do you get that every office that happens to ours that has inflation?
Well, we did. We did in the second SALT negotiations. It took a number of years to do it. And we had lots of very ambiguous areas that we had to negotiate about. The weapons in the hands of our allies, for instance, that was a major stumbling block for a long time. And finally, they gave up because we gave up on something else. I think it was the heavy missiles. We said, all right, we won't insist on the elimination of the heavy missiles. You don't insist on the inclusion of the forward-based systems. This kind of, you can work your way through in a negotiation of that sort. The advantage of a freeze is you avoid that kind of a debate right at the outset. You just say, let's stop building. We got enough of them. Both can retaliate, more than enough. Let's just stop building them here. Let's just not build any more. We'll go on to the negotiations for those complex negotiations for reduction later. I'm not saying that the freeze is just a simple, pen stroke to do it. It'd be a little more complicated than that. But it's a lot less complicated than a whole new negotiation. When President Carter came into office in 1977, he thought that he would try a new version of the SALT II negotiations. And he went over to the Soviet Union and suggested a substantial reduction of the land-based forces. And the Soviets practically threw him out of the Kremlin. They said, look, we've been negotiating on this thing for 5 years at this point. We've worked ourselves down through a series of compromises. Primarily the compromise at Vladivostok, which did solve some of the problems with President Ford and President Reagan. And you're coming in with this new idea, which mainly affects us. Doesn't hurt you very much at all. Sounds great, but it says we have to substantially reduce it. The actual SALT treaty, rather interesting. If you apply the numbers to land-based, you realize that what it did do was leave our land-based forces roughly where they were and caused the Soviets to reduce theirs by something like 250 launches. In other words, they even accepted that imbalance after a careful negotiation. But when the demand was that it drop further, they said, oh, Lord, no, it's too, we've worked this out over so much time, you can't just restart these negotiations every time a new president comes in. And it's one of the problems with the START thing. It is a new start on the SALT II negotiations. But the reason the Soviets are accepting that is that they know that SALT II in its current form is, as General Haig said, dead. It's dead politically. I don't think it should be dead, but it's dead politically in this country.
Yes, sir.
I can't help but wonder, although I spent the majority of your time talking about our relationship with the Soviet Union, what are we doing about what are we doing about covering ourselves with the backdoor by Chinese or worse yet, side door by a third world country like perhaps Libya or one like that, where we just have no control? What are we doing there?
Well, we have a non-proliferation treaty which we've signed and which we have agreed to, hasn't been ratified. The Soviets are also in accord with it. It works sort of partly. There's been a certain amount of cheating around the edges of it. We're debating with the Pakistani and the Indians and so forth about this all the time. The basic answer to your question is that none of these small powers, the Koreas, the Israels, the Indias, the South Africas, really threaten the world. They may threaten their neighbors, but they don't threaten the world for the time being. And they don't really threaten the United States and the Soviet Union at present. Whereas the United States and the Soviet Union have enough to actually destroy the world. Madam Gandhi, I thought, said the most useful comment on that one time. She said, don't you great powers come around and lecture us about the evils of nuclear weaponry until you get your own situation under control. Then we'll begin to listen to you. And, you know, you have to say that that makes a certain amount of sense. In the meantime, we'll just try to hold back on it. The Chinese have developed a little bit. They've developed an intercontinental missile, and they now have a submarine-launched one. But they're really, decades behind in the development of these. And if we can get the big powers under control, then I think we'll be in a position to jointly have some impact on some of these alternatives, these other powers. But until we get ourselves under control, I can't see us getting anywhere with the other powers.
Yes.
What effect do you think the rejection by the Dutch of the deployment of our Pershing II and cruise missile in Europe and the NATO forces, besides, not to mention, our rejection by our Congress of the deployment of the MX Dense Pack, will have on our bargaining chips at the strategic arms reduction talks?
Well, I think that it will have an adverse effect on our bargaining position. If the Soviets think they can get it for nothing, why should they give anything for it? That's a pretty simple Soviet position. If they're going to get it free, why pay for it in terms of a counteraction? I think it's not necessarily a be-all and end-all, however. In the first place, the other NATO powers did endorse the deployment here. In the second place, I think some imagination, we could achieve an agreement with the Soviets, which would maybe not be the zero option, but wouldn't be just the SS-20s also. and the full list of Pershings and Kruzmas, that there are midpoints in there that are potential, where we could keep the support of our European allies, do something so we don't give the impression of total fecklessness, and yet not just sort of automatically go into this 7-minute warning problem that is otherwise ahead of us now. That requires, and there's some indications of some possible developments in the negotiating positions that might allow that. This will get a little closer to the wire, but I think when it gets fairly close to the wire, I think that there will be some solution reached out of it. Probably not a totally satisfactory one, but some kind of a solution.
We're unfortunately running very short on time. If it's all right with Mr. Colby, there are a few people who've had their hands up for a long time. You have, of course, and there are 3 others. If we could recognize those as well, please. Yes.
In other words, I should give shorter answers.
We should expand on what you said as an alternative we were not spending any money on. Surrogate system. Isn't Mr. Reagan using the surrogate system in Pakistan and South America, Central America?
To a degree, yes.
Do you approve of that?
Yes, I do.
You do?
For instance, I think that when you talk about the subversion surrogate proxy problem, that you look for what is the appropriate strategy. And it isn't just a military one in that situation. I think that's really the major lesson of Vietnam that we should have learned. The present appropriations for El Salvador are $200 million this year for economic assistance and about $80 million for security assistance. Now that's not a bad relationship, because clearly the social imbalances, the tensions of the society there are a major part of the problem from which the hostile people can grow in their strength. So that the land reform program that we tried and we're helping with, I approve of, it's that kind of economic growth program that I think, in collaboration with the United States, with the free societies, that's the real answer to the subversion problem. Sure, you have to have some security protection in the process, but it's only a part of the answer. And I think a vigorous program of development in some of these developing countries can take the ball away from the extremists and not be against them, just make them irrelevant. The growth in the East Asia, in the so-called Gang of Four countries, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, the growth in some of the other countries around the world which have adopted a free system of their economy and a constitutional system of their governments. It is becoming increasingly clear in the third world that that's the path to progress, not the doctrinaire, disciplined, socialist or communist approach. Those are the countries that have failed. And you can see it in every continent. You can see it between Japan and China. You can see it between East and West Germany. You can see it between Kenya and Tanzania, right next door to each other. You can see it in Costa Rica and Cuba. You can see it in the Ivory Coast and Ghana, all over. That it's the ones that have followed the idea of a free approach to their process, and not perfect democracy, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that's the only test, but the combination has been remarkably successful. Now it's under threat right now because of the heavy debt burden, the result of the oil shocks and all the rest of it. And we have to work our way out of that. And if that costs us some money, it's well worth it. That's where we should have our major focus today, to solve some of the problems of Latin America before you get a collapse of the economy, a default of the national debts and things like that, and a total destabilization of the social structure. There's the.
How can you force them to use the money for economics rather than economic development rather than military?
Oh, they do. They do. If they have it, they do. I mean, you know, obviously they'll use the military, but our military aid program, you know, is really roughly half of our military aid program goes to Egypt and Israel, and the world shares the rest. No, it's not military, the total aid program. Roughly half of it goes to Egypt and Israel, and the whole world shares the rest. Well, you get down to per capita amounts, and you're dealing with fairly small amounts when you get to some of these countries, and that's not the way to create a dynamic growth pattern.
Just three more questions. This gentleman, and then Mr. Paulton, Mr. Frank.
Your thesis tonight was that nuclear war is unwinnable. We've had elements of this administration say that they think it is not only survivable, but winnable. Do you think this administration comprehends nuclear reality, and do you think our president comprehends nuclear reality?
Well, the leadership has repudiated some of those statements. That they did take place down somewhere, but both Mr. Weinberg and the president, I think the president is, I'm not sure the president has said unwinnable, but Mr. Weinberg clearly has. And I think the political level knows that it's unwinnable, aside from being an impossible thing to discuss.
Mr. Paulton.
How near do you think we are in a situation where weapons developed are might be unverifiable security? We've talked about quite a bit. Put the time parameters on what we're doing.
Some of the new weapons do raise problems of verification. The cruise missile, for instance, is going to create some real problems of verification. Because the difference between a nuclear one and a conventional one is almost imperceptible. There are some other new weapons. If the Soviets did test an SS-16 in that test the other day, then they might end up with a mobile missile, a mobile intercontinental missile, which would have substantial problems. That's why in SALT II, it was specifically said that they would not develop that weapon, because we were concerned about the mobile intercontinental missile. If they've decided to go ahead, since SALT II hadn't been passed, then we might have a problem there. However, I still go back to the fact that we may not be able to verify every last little one, but we today can give you a good estimate of the number of tanks there are in the Soviet forces. Now, I can't count every tank in the Soviet force, but I can develop a pretty good estimate of the total number by the production lines, by the numbers of units, by the truck park, tank parks, and all that sort of thing. And we can come up with a relatively good total number. Now, I think similarly that there are indicators. If you develop a cruise missile force with a nuclear warhead, there are going to be indicators that there are special storage capabilities in some places for the nuclear dimension of it. If you can't develop it that way, then you have a basis for asking for some kind of cooperative measure to work yourself out of that. Now, on the aircraft armed with cruise missiles under SALT II, the intercontinental aircraft, there's a so-called backfire bomber on the Soviet side. The question whether it's a naval one or whether it's an intercontinental one. If it's intercontinental, it ought to be counted, and if it's just a naval one, no. This is kind of fine line to get in these negotiations. But part of the agreement then was that some identifiable difference be developed in the nuclear version as distinct from the naval version. And that identifiable element is there to be seen. Now, you then say, well, could they cheat? Yeah, I suppose so, but they'd be taking chances if they're cheating, because you'd be looking at them, and then you get all the problems of how hard it would be really to cheat on something where you did focus on the need for some particular indicators, as to reassure you.
With an apology for our touch of greed for extending this question and answer period, one last question, Mr. Paul.
If there is such a thing as a common human being, citizen of the world, and such a citizen lives far beyond the confines of the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, if he was listening to you today, how should he comprehend what's going on around him, his responsibility, his capacity for preserving, his capacity to be a good son or a good mother, or to be a good citizen in his own society or a good system, do the normal things for which God created.
Well, I think if he were listening to me today, he would be appalled that we are seriously discussing here the end of the world. That it really is bizarre to be discussing a missile 30 minutes away that could destroy everything you can see. It would make him very concerned at the danger of life, to life generally. Now, what could he do about it? I think if he developed an interest and a concern in his government and his society about the dangers of these kinds of weapons, not only to us but to him, that this would be an additional pressure point pressing the leaders of both of these great powers to move ahead to some solution. Because obviously the one of these two leaders who comes up with a brilliant solution to this problem is going to be a hero to all mankind. And there's an incentive to do that, if the people, if they're aware that mankind as a whole is concerned about this thing. Thank you very much.